You were taught that Africa had no books, no universities, no intellectual tradition, no libraries. You were taught that civilization came to Africa on European ships, that before colonization, the continent was darkness, that learning, scholarship, philosophy, these were gifts from the outside world. And if you believed that, you were lied to. Because while Oxford was teaching a few hundred students in cold stone halls, there was a city in West Africa where over 25,000 scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, philosophy, and theology, where private libraries held more books than all of Europe combined, where professors debated the movement of stars, the nature of governance, and the interpretation of ancient texts in multiple languages. This city wasn't a myth. It wasn't a legend passed down through oral tradition alone. It existed, it thrived, and its achievements were documented by the very people who would later pretend it never mattered. The city was Timbuktu, and what happened to it wasn't an accident. The story you know goes like this. Timbuktu was a remote desert outpost, maybe a trading center, maybe exotic, but certainly not intellectual, certainly not a rival to European centers of learning. When colonizers arrived, they brought enlightenment, they brought progress, they brought books. That story is a construction, a narrative designed to justify invasion, extraction, and erasure. Let me show you what they buried. Timbuktu sits at the edge of the Sahara in what is now Mali. To European minds trained on green hills and stone cities, it seemed impossible that anything significant could emerge from sand and heat. The desert was a barrier. The desert was emptiness, but the desert was a highway. For centuries before Europe even imagined global trade, caravans crossed the Sahara carrying gold, salt, ivory, and ideas. Timbuktu wasn't isolated, it was connected to North Africa, to the Middle East, to the Mediterranean world. It sat at the intersection of the trans-Saharan trade routes, where the Niger River bends like a question mark through the landscape, and where trade flows, knowledge flows. By the 13th century, Timbuktu had become more than a market. It had become a magnet for scholars, Islamic teachers, West African intellectuals, Arab philosophers, mathematicians from across the continent. They converged on this city because it offered something rare in the medieval world: freedom of thought, resources, prestige. The Mali Empire, under rulers like Mansa Musa, poured wealth into Timbuktu, not just gold, not just monuments. They invested in mines. They built mosques that doubled as universities. They commissioned manuscripts. They paid scholars not just to preserve knowledge, but to create it. This wasn't imitation. This was innovation. 3 institutions defined Timbuktu's intellectual peak: the University of Sankore, the Djinguereber Mosque, and the Sidi Yahya Mosque. Together they formed an academic complex that educated thousands. Let that number sit with you. Thousands. At its height in the 15th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu hosted between 15,000 and 25,000 students. These weren't children memorizing prayers. These were advanced scholars studying disciplines that would shape mathematics, medicine, and philosophy for centuries. The University of Sankore alone functioned as a decentralized network of private colleges. Scholars established their own schools, their own libraries, their own curriculums. There was no single authority dictating what could be taught. There was debate. There was disagreement. There was intellectual freedom. Compare that to Europe in the same period. The Inquisition was burning books. Scholars who questioned church doctrine were imprisoned or executed. Universities operated under strict religious control. In Timbuktu, a scholar could challenge an interpretation of Islamic law, debate the nature of the cosmos, or explore mathematical proofs without fear of persecution. The city's reputation for tolerance drew thinkers, who had been exiled from more rigid societies. This matters, because intellectual progress doesn't happen in chains. What were they studying? Everything. Astronomy. Timbuktu's scholars tracked celestial movements with precision. They calculated prayer times based on the sun's position. They understood lunar cycles. They knew the Earth was round centuries before that fact became common knowledge in Europe. Mathematics. Algebraic texts from Baghdad were copied, studied, and expanded upon. Scholars worked on geometry, on commercial arithmetic, on inheritance calculations that required complex division. They understood zero. They understood fractions. They taught concepts that wouldn't reach some European universities for another 200 years. Medicine. Physicians in Timbuktu studied anatomy, pharmacology, and surgery. They wrote texts on treating fevers, wounds, infections. They combined Islamic medical traditions with indigenous West African herbal knowledge. They understood contagion. They practiced hygiene protocols. Law. Islamic jurisprudence was debated at the highest levels. Scholars wrote commentaries on the Maliki school of law. They adjudicated disputes. They trained judges. The legal texts produced in Timbuktu were referenced across the Islamic world. Philosophy. Scholars engaged with Greek philosophy filtered through Arabic translations. They read Aristotle, Plato, and Galen, but they also critiqued them. They didn't accept ancient knowledge as final. They interrogated it, and they wrote constantly. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable for those who erased it. Timbuktu's scholars produced hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Conservative estimates put the number at over 300,000 individual texts. Some estimates go higher, 700,000, a million. These weren't copies of the same book. These were unique works, original treatises, commentaries, poetry, scientific observations, historical chronicles, legal rulings, personal letters between scholars debating fine points of theology or astronomy. They wrote in Arabic, they wrote in Songhai, they wrote in Fulani, they wrote in Tamashek. They wrote in several languages within the same text, switching between them fluidly, and they didn't write on imported paper. West African paper production existed. Timbuktu had scriptoriums where manuscripts were copied by hand, illuminated with gold leaf, bound in leather. The craft of bookmaking was an art form. Private libraries were everywhere. Wealthy families collected books the way European nobility collected land. A single family might own a library of 1,500 volumes. Scholars traveled from Morocco, from Egypt, from Mecca, to access Timbuktu's collections. Think about what that means. This was a city where books were currency, where knowledge was wealth, where a man's reputation was built not on how many people he ruled, but on how many texts he had mastered. Leo Africanus, a Moroccan diplomat who visited Timbuktu in the early 16th century, wrote that the book trade was more profitable than any other business in the city. He described scholars who earned more from teaching and writing than merchants earned from gold. Books in Africa, before colonization, let that image replace the one you were given. But who were these scholars? Not abstractions, not nameless figures lost to time. We know their names. We have their works. Ahmed Baba al-Timbuktu, born in 1556. He wrote over 40 books on topics ranging from Islamic law to grammar to biography. His personal library contained 1,600 volumes. When Moroccan forces invaded Timbuktu in 1591, they arrested Ahmed Baba and exiled him to Marrakesh. Why? Because his influence was too great. Because scholars like him represented a form of power that couldn't be controlled through military force alone. Ahmed Baba spent years in exile, but even there, he taught, he wrote, he debated. When he finally returned to Timbuktu years later, his library had been scattered, stolen, destroyed. He spent the rest of his life trying to recover what had been lost. That detail matters. Mahmud Kati, a scholar and historian born in the late 15th century, he wrote the Tarikh al-Fattash, one of the most important chronicles of West African history. It documented the rise of the Songhai Empire, the intellectual life of Timbuktu, the reigns of rulers. It wasn't legend, it wasn't myth. It was rigorous historical writing, citing sources, cross-referencing dates. Abd al-Rahman al-Sadi, another historian, born in Timbuktu in 1596, he wrote the Tarikh al-Sudan, another chronicle of the region. His work described Timbuktu's universities, its scholars, its mosques. He recorded what was being lost, even as he wrote. The Moroccan invasion had fractured the city's intellectual life. Scholars were scattered, manuscripts were disappearing. He knew what was coming. And then Europe arrived, not with curiosity, not with respect, not to learn. With guns. The European conquest of West Africa didn't happen in a single moment. It was a slow strangulation. First came the slave trade, which ripped millions of people from the continent. Then came formal colonization, the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference of 1884, where European powers sat in a room in Germany and carved up an entire continent without a single African present. By the time French forces occupied Timbuktu in 1894, the city had already been declining for centuries. The Moroccan invasion of 1591 had shattered its political stability. The trans-Saharan trade routes had shifted. The rise of Atlantic trade had redirected wealth away from the Sahara. But the city's intellectual legacy still existed. The manuscripts still existed, the libraries still existed, and the French had a choice. They could have recognized Timbuktu for what it was. They could have preserved the manuscripts. They could have acknowledged that this city represented a level of scholarship that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. They didn't. Instead, they framed Timbuktu as primitive, as backward, as a relic of a past that had no value. French colonial administrators wrote reports describing the city as disappointing, as less impressive than they had imagined. They dismissed the manuscripts as religious superstition. They cataloged some, ignored most, and allowed countless others to be destroyed, sold, or scattered. Why? Because acknowledging Timbuktu's intellectual achievements would have undermined the entire justification for colonization. Colonialism required a narrative. That narrative was civilizing mission, the idea that Europe was bringing progress to a continent trapped in darkness, that Africans needed European education, European governance, European religion. But what if Africans already had universities? What if they already had legal systems, medical knowledge, astronomical understanding? What if they had been studying the same Greek philosophers that Europe claimed as the foundation of Western civilization? Then the mission collapses. Then the occupation becomes what it always was: theft. So Timbuktu had to be rewritten. It had to become exotic but not intellectual, mysterious but not sophisticated. A place of gold and legend, perhaps, but not a place of books and thought. European travelers who visited Timbuktu in the 19th and early 20th centuries expressed confusion, even disappointment. They had expected something grand, something monumental. What they found was a city of mud brick buildings, narrow streets, desert dust. They didn't understand what they were looking at, because intellectual life doesn't require marble columns. It doesn't require Gothic spires. It requires books, minds, and freedom. Timbuktu had all three. But by the time Europeans arrived, they were trained to see Africa as inferior. They couldn't reconcile what they saw with what they believed, so they adjusted what they saw. The manuscripts survived. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough. In the 20th century, as Mali gained independence, efforts began to recover and preserve Timbuktu's written heritage. Families who had guarded manuscripts for generations began to share them. Hidden libraries were opened. Scholars started cataloging what remained. What they found was staggering. Texts on astronomy that demonstrated knowledge of planetary motion, medical treatises describing surgical techniques, mathematical manuscripts exploring concepts that Europe wouldn't formalize for centuries, historical chronicles that rewrote the timeline of West African kingdoms, and personal documents, letters between scholars, poetry, diaries, the everyday intellectual life of a city that had been teaching the world while Europe burned witches. These manuscripts are now housed in libraries across Timbuktu and Bamako. The Ahmed Baba Institute, named after the scholar exiled for his knowledge, holds thousands. Private family collections hold thousands more. Digitization projects are racing to preserve them before time, climate, and conflict destroy what colonization couldn't. But here's the tragedy. Most people still don't know. Most curricula still don't teach it. The narrative of African backwardness persists because it was never about evidence. It was about power. Let's be precise about what was lost. When the Moroccan invasion of 1591 destabilized Timbuktu, scholars fled. They took what books they could carry. They left the rest. Over the following centuries, libraries were raided, sold off, abandoned. Families buried manuscripts to protect them. Some survived. Many didn't. When French colonizers arrived, they showed little interest in preservation. Some manuscripts were shipped to Paris, where they remain in French archives to this day. Others were left to decay. The Sahara is not kind to paper. When jihadist groups occupied Timbuktu in 2012, they burned manuscripts deliberately. They saw the city's intellectual tradition as heretical. They destroyed centuries of knowledge in hours. But even before that, even before jihadists or colonizers, there was neglect. Because once the narrative shifted, once Timbuktu became a footnote in history rather than a centerpiece, no one invested in preserving what made it extraordinary. The world lost entire fields of knowledge, mathematical proofs that might have accelerated human understanding, medical insights that could have saved lives, philosophical debates that might have reshaped how we think about governance, ethics, science. We'll never know what was in the manuscripts that turned to dust. We'll never know what was written by scholars whose names are lost. We'll never know what Timbuktu could have contributed if its intellectual tradition had been allowed to continue. That's not abstract loss. That's human loss. So why does this matter now? Because the story we tell about the past shapes the future we imagine. If Africa had no intellectual tradition, then African education systems can be treated as starting from zero. If Africa produced no original thought, then African scholars can be dismissed. If Africa was darkness before Europe, then European models of everything, government, economy, education, culture, can be imposed as universal truth. But if Timbuktu existed, if it thrived, if it produced knowledge that rivaled and in some cases surpassed what Europe was producing at the same time, then the entire framework collapses. Then we have to ask different questions. What would African education look like if it built on Sankore instead of Oxford? What would African philosophy look like if it centered scholars like Ahmed Baba instead of treating thought as something imported? What scientific advances were lost when Timbuktu's libraries burned? These aren't hypothetical questions, they're urgent ones, because the erasure of Timbuktu wasn't just historical, it's ongoing. Every curriculum that skips from ancient Egypt to the Atlantic slave trade is erasing Timbuktu. Every textbook that treats Africa as prehistory until Europeans arrive is erasing Timbuktu. Every conversation about global intellectual history that centers Greece, Rome, and Europe without mentioning West African scholarship is erasing Timbuktu, and that erasure has consequences. It shapes how African students see themselves. It shapes how the world sees Africa. It shapes what seems possible. Here's what they didn't want you to understand. Timbuktu wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't the only center of learning in Africa. It was part of a broader intellectual tradition that stretched across the continent. The Library of Alexandria in Egypt, the scholars of Aksum in Ethiopia, the universities of Fez and Cairo, the oral historians of the griots who preserved centuries of knowledge without writing. Africa was never a blank slate. It was never waiting for civilization. It was civilization. And when colonizers arrived, they didn't find ignorance. They found systems they couldn't control, knowledge they couldn't monopolize, traditions they couldn't dominate. So they buried them, they renamed them, rewrote them, removed them from the record. But the manuscripts survived, the memory survived. And now, slowly, the truth is being excavated. Imagine walking through Timbuktu in 1500, the city at its peak, the narrow streets filled with students debating in the shade, the markets selling not just gold and salt, but books, rare texts copied by hand, commentaries on ancient works, new treatises. You hear Arabic, Songhai, Tamashek, Fulani. You hear arguments about the interpretation of a Quranic verse, about the calculation of an inheritance, about the orbit of Venus. You pass the University of Sankore. Inside, a lecture hall where a professor explains geometry using diagrams drawn in sand. Students take notes on wooden tablets, copying them later to paper. Some of these students have traveled for months to study here. Some will return home and establish their own schools, spreading what they've learned. You pass a private library. The owner, a merchant who made his fortune in the salt trade, has collected over 1,000 volumes. He employs scribes to copy rare texts. He hosts scholars who visit from across the Islamic world. His collection rivals that of any European noble. You pass the markets. A bookseller displays illuminated manuscripts. Gold leaf catches the light. The craftsmanship rivals anything produced in Cairo or Baghdad. A customer haggles over a medical text from a scholar in Timbuktu. The price is high. Books are valuable. Knowledge is valuable. This was real. This happened. And then it was taken, not all at once, not in a single invasion, but piece by piece, century by century, the world forgot, or pretended to forget. By the 19th century, when European explorers were discovering Timbuktu, they treated it as a curiosity, a legend. They wrote about their disappointment that it wasn't built of gold. They didn't mention the manuscripts. They didn't mention the scholars. They didn't mention the universities, because acknowledging those would have required acknowledging something unacceptable, that Africa had been producing knowledge while Europe was struggling through the Dark Ages, that African scholars were teaching mathematics, astronomy, and medicine while European universities were still being founded, that the intellectual capital of the medieval world wasn't just in Baghdad or Cordoba, but also in Timbuktu. That narrative didn't serve empire, so it was suppressed. But here's what they couldn't suppress. The manuscripts still exist. Fragile? Yes. Incomplete? Yes. But real. You can see them. You can read them. You can trace the handwriting of scholars who died 500 years ago, who debated questions that still matter. You can see the mathematical proofs, the astronomical charts, the medical diagrams, the historical chronicles. You can see the evidence that everything you were taught about Africa was incomplete at best, deliberately false at worst. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the power of primary sources. That's the power of documentation. Colonizers can rewrite narratives, but they can't rewrite manuscripts written centuries before they arrived. The scholars of Timbuktu left proof. They left their work. And that work is a refutation of every lie told about African intellectual inferiority. So what now? The Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu continues to preserve manuscripts. Digitization projects are making them accessible to researchers worldwide. Scholars are translating them, analyzing them, publishing them. The story of Timbuktu is being resurrected, slowly, incompletely, but undeniably. And as it emerges, it forces a reckoning. Because if Timbuktu was real, if its universities were real, if its scholars were real, then every assumption about Africa's past needs to be questioned. Every textbook needs to be rewritten. Every curriculum needs to be expanded. Every conversation about global intellectual history needs to be reframed. That's not revisionism. That's correction. Here's the final thing they don't want you to understand. Timbuktu's destruction wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. When you erase a people's intellectual tradition, you don't just steal their history. You steal their confidence. You steal their reference points. You steal their ability to imagine themselves as creators, innovators, thinkers. You make them dependent on foreign education systems, foreign languages, foreign frameworks of thought. And that dependency becomes self-perpetuating. Because if you're taught that your ancestors contributed nothing, why would you look to them for answers? Why would you build on their work? Why would you imagine that your culture contains the seeds of solutions? You wouldn't. You'd look elsewhere. You'd defer to others. You'd accept that progress comes from outside. That was the point. But it was a lie, and Timbuktu is the proof. 25,000 scholars, hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, centuries of intellectual tradition. That's not a footnote. That's not a curiosity. That's not an exotic detail to mention in passing. That's a civilization, and they destroyed it, deliberately, systematically, not with a single invasion, but with centuries of erasure, suppression, and rewriting. They buried the libraries, they scattered the scholars, they rewrote the textbooks. They told the world that Africa had no intellectual history, and the world believed them. But the manuscripts survived, and the truth survived. And now it's emerging, and once it's out, it can't be put back. So here's the question they never wanted you to ask. What else did they erase? If Timbuktu was this significant, this sophisticated, this intellectually vibrant, and you never learned about it, what else don't you know? What other African cities produced knowledge? What other scholars wrote texts that were destroyed? What other universities trained thousands of students? What other traditions were interrupted, suppressed, or rewritten? How much of what you think you know about history is incomplete? How much of what you think you know about Africa is wrong? Those questions should haunt you, because the answers are still being uncovered. The manuscripts are still being translated. The evidence is still emerging. And every piece of evidence that surfaces is another refutation of the lie you were taught. Africa was never empty. It was never waiting. It was never silent. It was speaking. It was writing. It was teaching. And if you want to hear what it was saying, you have to be willing to listen to the voices they tried to silence. You have to be willing to read the manuscripts they tried to burn. You have to be willing to learn the history they tried to erase, because that history is still here, fragile, threatened, but undeniable. And it's waiting for you to find it. If this changed how you see Africa's past, then you're ready for more. Because Timbuktu isn't the only story they buried. It's not the only civilization they erased. It's not the only truth they rewrote. There are more, many more, and they're all waiting. Ancient Africa Untold is dedicated to resurrecting these stories, to showing you the history that was deliberately removed from your education, to revealing the civilizations, the leaders, the achievements, the knowledge that colonization tried to destroy. This is just the beginning. If you're tired of the lies, subscribe, because there are more truths to uncover, more narratives to challenge, more history to reclaim, and every story we tell is one they tried to erase. Join us. because this knowledge was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be known, and now it will be.